It's not an analogy. It's literally correct.
Okay.
So it's not.
I'm struggling with the software.
But software is basically, if you think what software is, if you are interacting with computers, it is a disembodied causal pattern, right? It's very much a spirit.
Joscha Bach, welcome to How Light Gets In Festival.
Thanks.
So you're currently a cognitive scientist at Liquid AI, is that correct?
Yes, I help Liquid AI with strategy.
Cool. And you're setting up a consciousness research institute?
Yeah, I'm interested in basically closing the gap between what we currently understand in machine learning and artificial intelligence and how minds work and how to understand, how to get closer to the way in which our mind works.
I mean, part of me doesn't like when people ask people to define consciousness because part of it feels like the closest thing to us. But how are you defining consciousness?
Experientially, when I pointed it, I think there are two aspects that fall out. And one is, it's a second order perception. Basically, it's not just that there's content, but that I'm aware that there is content. So the second order perception is important. It's not metacognition because it's perceptual. It's more immediate than the reflexive cognition. And the other aspect is that consciousness is always happening now. It seems to create this bubble of nowness that we inhabit. And I suspect that consciousness is basically an operator that our mind is discovering that increases coherence. And by increasing coherence, by making more statements, models, and so on simultaneously true, by creating a consensus between all the different contexts of our working memory, we create an area in the mind that is without contradictions. And we can have contradictions in our working memory and so on, but we can never have a perception that contradicts itself. And so consciousness seems to be this principle, and I suspect that it's a learning algorithm. It's a learning algorithm that is not based on minimizing a prediction error, but on maximizing coherence, on maximizing this area in which we don't have contradictions, in which we can predict and explain things.
Tricks of the eye, illusions, do they not kind of count as contradictions?
No. I think that when we are perceiving the world, we have a model that is not probabilistic, but possibilistic. Right? You should be able to recognize a tiger going after you, even if tigers at a festival like this are very improbable. But because they are physically possible and because they fit in our perception, we should be able to recognize them. This makes the search space of possible representations extremely large. So for our mind to converge onto something that is conformant with what we perceive, it learns bias. It learns a way to interpret what we are seeing in a probabilistic fashion first to get to the right explanation. And these probabilistic biases that we have on top of our perception shift us into thinking that an angle is a right angle, because we've seen so many right angles, that certain objects are in front of other objects where they might not be. And on average, this is correct and basically makes you converge much, much faster. But in edge cases, it leads to wrong interpretations. And most of the optical illusions that we perceive are a result of that. That basically our perceptual system is biased towards certain perceptions that eventually we have to remedy. And sometimes it's difficult to find a solution. It's like a puzzle. Yet, when we look at this, we will always see that there are shapes and so on. We see that how these shapes are relating. Every pixel that we see basically can be attributed to one object, and all the objects can be attributed to being part of a scene that we inhabit.
Okay, so consciousness is trying to make the world coherent. It's always now, and it's without contradictions. It also has a self-reflexivity to it, you said. Do animals have that self-reflexivity? Because self-consciousness seems, some people argue unique to humans, but to animals...
I think there is this little bit of human vanity to think that consciousness is somehow super complicated and the pinnacle of mental development. But we observe that not only Nobel Prize winners have consciousness after they reach their peak, but little infants have it already. And they become conscious before they can do anything else. And if you don't gain consciousness at the beginning of our life, we remain vegetables. It seems to be a prerequisite for mental development, not the pinnacle of it. And if consciousness is so simple that infants can have it, then it's ridiculous to say that cats don't have it, right? And also when you are interacting with a cat or with a dog or with a bird or a mouse, you notice that they are at some level aware of their awareness.
Okay, so you think animals are aware that they're aware?
I think it's almost ridiculous to say that they're not. The more interesting question is, are insects conscious? Right, so basically, if consciousness is a training algorithm, that is the simplest training algorithm that nature has discovered for a self-organizing system like our nervous system, because we don't see any humans that has running anything simpler than consciousness to learn, right? It seems to be the simplest thing that nature came up with. and it is this prerequisite for learning. Maybe it also works on insects. I don't know that, but I'm reluctant to say it's clearly not.
Are you a physicalist about consciousness then?
Yeah. I think that every theory that we are making about reality has to account for the fact that the experiment of physicists work. The standard model seems to be correct to many decimal digits. And even though it's incomplete, it describes in the energy regime that we live in all the information conservation. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of hidden back channel to influence our reality without disproving a majority of the scientific experiments that physicists have done in the last 100 years. And that's why I suspect that every theory that tries to explain consciousness has to account for the fact that the theories of physicists seem to be largely correct.
Correct by what measure? Surely we haven't kind of reached the end of physics, so surely our physics is still wrong in some way, and so
Yes.
our current physical theories are not true. So I mean, how does that?
If something wants to influence the physical world, it needs to exert some kind of effect on the physical world.
Does the mind do that? Does consciousness
It
do
does that, but it doesn't do this by non-physical means. I think that the mind is a pattern in the physical reality. It's a causal pattern that is self-reinforcing. And we know these causal patterns in other contexts. We call them software. The software is disembodied, but it's still interacting with physics. And there are large parts of the physical world that we cannot explain if we do not assume the existence of software. If you look at your phone, for instance, the software that is running on it doesn't really care about how many transistors are there and how much memory you have in there. But it is implemented on the activation states of the transistors. And so there's this interaction between hardware and software where the hardware is providing the mechanism and the software is the pattern that actually matters, the actual invariance that we care about.
But that software exists in, I mean, I'm not a computer scientist, exists in data centers. Surely it's not still physical. And in consciousness, is consciousness physical? I can't...
Well, it's as physical as other software is. But the consciousness that we have, there's a big difference between the software that we are writing on computers. It's self-organizing. It needs to be able to convince the cells to run it. And these cells are little the neurons in your brain, little single-celled animals that try to survive and that serve their own interests. And if you want to run on them, you need to convince them to run you. So you need to provide some benefit. And you are some software that is basically possessing groups of neurons. And you do this by training the neurons to run you. So there needs to be some kind of seed that enables this kind of entraining of yourself. Something that is able to colonize the brain, turns it into a mind, and inside of that mind, which is like a protocol layer, generate a game engine that is giving you a simulation of a physical universe in which you have sounds, colors, peoples, emotions, their interactions, a model of yourself. And at some point, this conscious perspective is relocating into this nexus of the personal self. And you think of yourself as a human being, you use I to refer to yourself. And this conscious creator of your mental contents that is dreaming you thinks that it's no longer the dreamer, but it's a person inside of that dream. And this is our normal everyday experience.
So the brain is hardware, consciousness is software. I'm struggling with the analogy somewhat.
It's not an analogy, it's literally correct.
Okay.
So it's not...
I'm struggling with the software.
But software is basically, if you think what software is, if you are interacting with computers, it is a disembodied causal pattern, right? It's very much a spirit. Only the software that we are building is not self-organizing. It's constructed by humans, and it works because we force the hardware to enact it. We make it so deterministic that the hardware has no choice. But your cells, at some level, have a choice in the same way as the group of people has the choice to run a religion or not. And so you need to convince all the individuals to believe in the shared spirit of an organization, of a nation state, of a family, of a relationship, or of a religion. And in the same way, you need to convince yourselves to believe in you.
Is software, I'm still struggling, is software physical? I can't see your consciousness right now. Software's a pattern. Patterns, again, feel physical to me. And this seems to be something completely non-physical, non-observable.
Let's use an example that you might be more familiar with. Let's take money. Right? Money is clearly not physical. And money, on the other hand, is real. It's implemented in the world. There are large parts of the world that make no sense if you do not assume the existence of money, because many others do it too.
Yeah.
And the money is not just an imagination that you're having, but there are banknotes, which are sheets of paper with ink on them. But you don't care really about the fibers of the paper. You don't care about the type of ink and so on. There are bank accounts that are held in computers that hold all these numbers. And so money is a causal pattern. It's a software that we have implemented that runs on part of the world and provides some of its causal structure. And I think that software is all in this category. It's basically a law-like structure that only emerges through coarse graining. When you look at the world at a certain level of abstraction, when you project it into some conceptual pattern. But these conceptual patterns themselves can be causal, right? Your mind doesn't care whether an individual neuron dies. It can recruit a new neuron and train it to do the same function.
I'm hearing that partly that consciousness is an abstraction or part of abstraction, and part of me wants to say that consciousness is the most real thing. It doesn't feel like an abstraction, and mathematics feels like the abstraction.
Yes. But consciousness is the only thing that can create feeling, right? Physics cannot. You cannot be conscious in the physical universe. The physical universe is some weird mathematical object that is currently described by quantum mechanics and so on. And it doesn't feel like anything. The physics, as it's being described, is not this world with stuff in space that you can touch. That is a simulation in your mind. That is your brain produces to explain sensory data.
Agreed.
Physics is a parent universe that nobody has ever visited and that we are making arcane theories about. Right? It's not the real world in a sense. The real world is the one that we experience. But the sense of realness is a trance. And it's a trance that we can break. You can test this. You can deconstruct your qualia. You can notice that they're just representations. You can get to a state where you realize that your personal self is just a representation that you can deconstruct and are no longer identified with.
The mystical experience, I would call that personally.
Yeah. Sometimes I don't know what a mystical experience is because the boundaries of this term are very unclear.
William James, kind of noetic experience, loss of the self, kind of beyond contradictions, as you were saying before. Great white light, that type of thing, those type of phenomena. And that sounds like what you're talking about, deconstructing qualia there.
But I'm a computer scientist, and so these terms do not mean very much to me because if I only understand what I can implement. And this points to a large problem in philosophy. Basically, there are two types of languages in a way. The mathematical languages, which come from the ground up, and where every single token, every word, every symbol that you're defining has the clear meaning, and you try to build up these meanings from the ground up so you can determine what's true and false. And in philosophy, you try to talk about our existential reality and the world that we are in. And it's very difficult for those two areas to meet. The mathematical languages are so simple that they cannot actually talk about the real world. If you want to use mathematics to talk about the real world, you have to simplify the world so much that it fits into these mathematical abstractions. On the other hand, it's very difficult to say true things in philosophy because it's very hard to define your terms so well that they actually refer to meaningful structure that pans out. And to me, this idea of making philosophy and mathematics meet, that you can basically mathematize your philosophical idea, requires that we are mathematizing this intermediator, the human mind. Right? So we basically need to mathematize the human mind. We need to turn it into a structure where we fully know what operations it performs to do philosophy. So these terms can at some point meet. And I think that the human mind itself is limited in our ability to understand because it's quite mushy, right? We have this vague reference and they are grounded in perceptual constructs that we largely only know as a pattern matching and not as a deep understanding. So I find a lot of discussions with philosophers are frustrating who say machines cannot understand something, and then you ask them what understanding is, and they don't understand what understanding is. They just have this very weird pattern matching, and this pattern matching is not good enough to tell them whether machines understand something or don't.
I mean, I'm struggling with the mathematization of consciousness because it seems to me that no number of zeros and ones that you put together no equation will spit out consciousness on the other end. And if it does, how would you know that?
It's not necessarily about zeros and ones. It's about finding a representation in which you can describe arbitrary systems. And the premise of computer science, in a way, that is also experimentally quite well validated, is that we can describe any function using state transitions. And we can describe all these state transitions using computational operators. So basically looking at discernible differences, and there's a finite resolution to all the discernible differences for them to matter. And we can use these transitions between sets of discernible differences to describe arbitrary behavior. And if we agree that consciousness is a behavior of some kind, then it follows that we're able to describe it in such languages.
I definitely agree with that. That consciousness is a behavior of some kind.
What do you think it is?
I think it's awareness, as you said.
Yes.
And I think it's my awareness from the inside. I describe it. It's what it's like to be me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so my answer to this is you do not actually exist. You exist as if, right? You don't exist in physics. The neurons themselves don't feel anything. The brain doesn't feel anything because they're physical mechanisms. But for all these neurons and cells in your body, it would be super useful to know what it would be like to be an organism, to be a person in a social environment, to be somebody who is hungry, who is in love, who cares about things, who experiences things in real time. And because they don't have that, they make a simulation of what that would be like. And that simulation, the output of that simulation, is being used to drive the organism. And you are that simulation. You exist as if you are a simulated being. You are existing only in a dream, not in physics. And this is a big confusion because we think that this is physics, right? But it's another aspect of the dream. And so you're part of that dream of a world with a person inside. And that's, I think, what makes it so confusing. But I think we are as real as a character in a novel. And we have these emotions and feelings and awareness because the author of the novel, our brain, a mechanism, writes it into the story.
I mean, I would agree that the self is an illusion. The self is not an object. But I think consciousness is not an illusion. Consciousness is the most certainty we have, kind of returning to Descartes. I mean, I think ontology is impossible, and if you kind of trying to reach through the world to see what it's like, it's a dream. But I mean, I'm wondering how you therefore know it's a dream if you're part of the dream.
I think often when people say illusion, what they mean is a construction, and so I'm personally also completely agree with Keith Frankish's terminology in illusionism, but because I think it's a construct. Consciousness, and it's simulated, which means you have a causal structure that is modeling a domain on a different causal substrate. In a similar way as a computer game is giving you a model of what it would be like to shoot a gun in the real world, but it's not doing this by actually moving elementary particles around or simulations of the elementary particles, but it's doing a high-level simulation that allows you to causally interact with the game in a similar way as you would do with the real world. Whereas simulacrum is more like a movie, right? It produces a series of observables, but there is no way for you to interact with the movie because it doesn't actually have a causal structure. And I suspect that our mental contents, our experience of being conscious, is partially a simulation and partially a simulacrum.
What do you mean by simulacrum?
It just means it produces a series of observables that give you the impression that something happened in a particular way. And there was a causal mechanism that you're getting, but it's not.
I can buy that maybe free will is an illusion. I'm wondering about this.
No, I don't think that it is. Free will is actually, it was never a physical thing. That is the confusion. Free will is a psychological phenomenon. And its will is the psychological representation of a commitment of your cognitive architecture to perform a certain thing. And free will is the representation that you're making a decision for the first time, which means you are at the edge of uncertainty. You cannot predict your own decision. And it's a relative thing. It really depends on that factor. Imagine you're looking at your child and you know exactly what the child is going to do, but the child doesn't know it yet. And so from your perspective, the child doesn't have free will. From its own, it does. Or you're a stage musician, you get people on stage, you have done this trick a few hundred times, you know exactly what they're going to do. For them, it's mind-blowing that you are able to predict that. And so from your perspective, they don't have free will. From their perspective, they're making the decision for the first time and they do have free will. And so free will is that representation. And it's an important representation to have. And it's a really important psychological phenomenon we have. But a lot of confusion in philosophy is caused by the inability to distinguish psychological phenomena from physical or ontological ones. Consciousness is a psychological phenomenon, not a physical one.
I'm wondering about the epistemological versus the ontological, because from my point of view, I think consciousness is the fundamental thing via which we know everything. We don't know anything about maths or computer programs when we're asleep. So consciousness, any knowledge requires consciousness. And so it feels like that's the epistemological starting point for ontology to take place. But it sounds like you are arguing that the maps and the computer code is the ontological starting point.
Yes, but we have to get there because in order to discover these languages, we have to think about the nature of representation. And that's itself a mathematical problem. When we are thinking something, when we are observing something, when we are reasoning, when we are interacting with each other, we always have to use representations, which are causal patterns that allow us to direct behavior. And we can mathematically infer the limits of representations and the ways in which representations are working, which I think is the greatest philosophical progress that we made in the last century. And consciousness itself is not a certainty epistemologically. It's the impression that something is going on, but you don't know what it is. And when you check it, you often remember having been in conscious states that are actually impossible to have been in. Right? So you realize that your memories of the conscious states that you have been in are constructs, that can be wrong, that there are actually types of representations. And of course, the only way in which you experience something as happening in which you relate to it as meaningful is by having this reflexive mechanism. But the question is not so much how can I make this fundamental, because how can it be fundamental? How can it emerge by itself? But what are the conditions for such representation, such behavior, such self-report, such experiences to emerge in a physical universe or in any kind of mathematical, hypothetical universe that has any kind of regularity in there?
Joscha Bach, pleasure to meet you.
Exactly.
And thank you for coming to How the Light Gets In Festival.
Thank you.